Welcome to the medieval bedroom asterisk. Let's set the scene. It's the Middle Ages, somewhere between the fall of Rome and the invention of the printing press. Most people can't read, castles are drafty, and bathing isn't exactly a daily habit. You're either a peasant, a priest, or a noble with way too much fabric on. There are no electric lights, no TikTok, no deodorant, and definitely no sex education class. But you know what did exist? S3X. Yup. Even in a world ruled by popes, plagues, and plows, people still found time to get frisky, behind closed doors, under haystacks, after too much meat at the harvest festival. But here's the catch. No one wanted to talk about it. Not openly. Anyway. See. The Middle Ages were a weird mix of silence and obsession when it came to S3X. On the one hand, the church was like your very strict grandmother times 1,000. It had rules about everything: what kind of bread to eat on Sundays, how long your sleeves should be, and of course, how and when to do the deed. On the other hand, people were still people, curious, impulsive, affectionate, bored, and very much not saints. So how do we even know what medieval S3X was like? Well, it's a bit like detective work. We're talking about dusty church records, court cases, old letters, medical books written in Latin, and the occasional naughty doodle hidden in the margins of a manuscript. Seriously, some monks got real creative with their pen and ink art. Most of what we know comes not from people bragging about their bedroom adventures, but from people getting caught. Adultery trials, brothel regulations, confessions, and sermons warning the faithful to stop touching themselves. Yes, even that was a sin. So, before we dive into the steamy and sometimes very unsteamy world of medieval romance, let's get one thing straight. It wasn't all candles and corsets. This wasn't Game of Thrones. Most people didn't even have mattresses, and yet, somehow, S3X still happened. A lot. And it wasn't just about passion. S3X was tied up with religion, power, money, family, inheritance, and status. Who you slept with could raise you up or ruin your life. Who you married could determine your future. And who you didn't marry, well, that could be a scandal, a lawsuit, or even a public shaming in the town square. Also, the medieval world had some truly wild beliefs about how bodies worked. Some doctors thought women needed to have regular releases or they'd get sick. Others claimed you could tell if a woman had slept with someone just by looking at her urine. So yeah, science hadn't quite caught up yet. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. This series is going to take you through all the medieval madness. Love, lust, scandal, shame, brothels, bedrooms, and birth control. Yes, they had something like it. We'll meet peasants trying to sneak a kiss during harvest season, nobles who kept lovers on the side, monks who wrote spicy poems, and townsfolk caught in very awkward situations. Some stories will be sweet, others not so much, because while romance existed, so did power imbalances, forced marriages, and ideas about consent that wouldn't exactly hold up today. So here's the plan. We'll wander through fields and castles, churches and bathhouses, confessionals and bedrooms. We'll meet sassy widows, wandering knights, curious teenagers, and more than a few frustrated priests. Every chapter will pull back the curtain just a little more. No judgment, no modern shame, just history, the way it really was: messy, weird, human. Now, before we move on, a quick note about words. I'm going to say S3X a lot. You know what I mean? I'm writing it this way so the bots don't think we're being weird. You'll also hear words like prostitute, virgin, and affair. But don't worry, we're keeping it comfy, chill, and bedtime appropriate. No graphic stuff. Just honest, curious history. Also, yes, people had feelings, crushes, heartbreak, jealousy, affection, awkwardness. Just like today, it wasn't all arranged marriages and doom. And no, not everyone waited until marriage. That was the rule. But let's just say, not everyone followed the rule. So if you've ever wondered what it was really like to fall in love in a world where you might only own 2 pairs of socks, or what medieval birth control looked like, or why some people believed you could lose your virginity from riding a horse, spoiler, you can't. You're in the right place. Because the medieval world may be far away, but its people, they're closer to us than you think. They whispered in the dark. They kissed when no one was looking. They hoped. They feared. They loved. Just like us. And that's what makes this topic not just fascinating but kinda beautiful. So, pull up your scratchy wool blanket. Blow out your candle. Snuggle into your hay-stuffed mattress. We're about to dive into the secret, spicy, and sometimes silly world of medieval intimacy. Sweet dreams. Dirty minds in a holy world. If there's one thing the medieval church really didn't want to talk about, but also kind of couldn't stop talking about, it was S3X. On paper, S3X was supposed to be sacred, holy, reserved strictly for married couples who wanted to make babies. That's it. No fun allowed. No experimenting. No nonsense. But in reality, people were definitely still getting busy, and the church, it was very, very interested in keeping track of who was doing what, when, and with whom. Welcome to the most awkward game of God is watching in history. Let's start with the basics. The medieval Christian church taught that S3X was only acceptable inside marriage, and even then, it was basically a necessary evil. Something you had to do to make more Christians, not something you were supposed to enjoy. In fact, some of the early church thinkers like St. Augustine were really, really intense about it. He believed that even married couples should feel a little bit guilty, like, if you were smiling too much afterward, you probably sinned a little, and don't even think about doing it on Sundays, or during Lent, or Advent, or before communion, or on feast days, or during pregnancy, or if you were too happy about it. Basically, S3X was only okay on very specific days, with the right person, in the right position, with the lights off, while thinking about taxes. Okay, maybe not the taxes part, but you get the idea. The list of forbidden times for S3X could easily add up to more than half the calendar. And even during the approved times, there were still plenty of rules. For example, certain positions were considered sinful. Anything too creative. Nope. The church preferred the missionary approach, which wasn't actually called that yet, but the idea was that the man should be on top and the woman should stay humble. Why? Because anything else was seen as unnatural, rebellious, too much fun. Now, let's talk about monks and priests. They were supposed to be celibate. As in, no S3X, ever. But, surprise, that didn't always happen. Many priests had unofficial wives or girlfriends. Some even had children. In fact, in some places, everyone kind of knew which priest had a family on the side, and they just looked the other way. There were also tons of sermons warning nuns about temptations of the flesh, which, in medieval speak, meant, don't touch yourself, don't look at boys, don't even think about romance novels, which didn't exist yet, but they still somehow knew to worrying. Even confession, yes. That quiet little moment when you told a priest your sins was often about S3X. People would confess all sorts of things. Having S3X outside of marriage, cheating, lustful thoughts, and more. And priests had to sit there and listen, stone-faced, and then assign penance, like 100 prayers, or walking barefoot to a shrine, or donating money to the church. Spoiler, money helped everything. There's actually a whole genre of medieval writing called penitentials, basically handbooks for priests, filled with very specific sins and exactly how much punishment each one earned. Examples include, if a man lies with his wife but does not intend children, 7 years of penance. If a woman lies with a man not her husband, 5 years, maybe more. If someone uses a contraceptive verb, big sin, even if it didn't work. If to monks, well, you get the idea, very long penance. These books are how we know, though much about medieval S3X behavior. Not because people talked about it freely but because they felt guilty about it, or got caught, or were afraid of eternal fire and brimstone. But not everyone lived in fear. Some folks, especially in rural areas, had a much more relaxed attitude. They didn't always care what the bishop said. They had their own customs, old beliefs, and, let's be honest, they were busy with farming and surviving and trying not to freeze in winter. Out in the countryside, people might still believe in old fertility rites, or bless their beds with herbs, or tell stories about love and mischief. The church didn't always reach that far into daily life, especially if there wasn't a priest around every corner. But in towns and cities, things were more strict. You might get fined or publicly shamed if you were caught in the wrong bed. And if your neighbor saw something sketchy going on, they could snitch. People loved to gossip, especially when it involved who was not behaving Christianly. And if you think the church was only judging regular folks, think again. There were whole scandals involving bishops with mistresses, popes with secret children, monks writing very suspicious poetry, and nuns getting letters from forbidden lovers. It was all a bit complicated, because the truth is, medieval people weren't robots. They had urges, curiosity, desire, just like we do now. But they lived in a time when almost everything about the body, especially the naked parts, was wrapped in guilt and fear. Still, you can't completely erase human nature, and despite all the preaching, people kept on loving, secretly, quietly, or sometimes very loudly and in public, depending on the wine supply. So, what have we learned? In the Middle Ages, S3X wasn't just about the people under a blanket. It was about sin, about salvation, about control. The church said, this is how you love. This is who you can love. This is when. This is where. And please, don't enjoy it too much. But of course, people found a way, because no matter how many rules were written in Latin, there was always someone sneaking a kiss in the cloister garden, or sharing a wink during Vespers. And honestly, that might be the most human part of all. When you could legally do it. Tone, chill, simple, bedtime style, with light humor and a dose of historical awkwardness. So, when could you actually do it in the Middle Ages, like, legally? Without breaking church rules, or getting shamed by your neighbors, without a priest glaring at you, without earning a decade of penance and a bad seat in heaven? Well, the answer is only after marriage, and even then, the list of rules was longer than your grandmother's grocery list. Let's start with the basics. In medieval Europe, marriage wasn't just about love. It was a contract, a business deal, a way to pass on land, combine families, or improve your social standing. Your future husband or wife might have been chosen for you before you even learned to walk. And if you were rich or noble, forget romance. Your marriage might have been arranged before you were even born. But even peasants muddied boots and all had to follow church rules. By the 12th century, the church had taken control of marriage laws. That meant all S3X had to happen inside a church-approved marriage, or else it didn't count. Worse, it was a sin. Now here's where it gets tricky. You didn't actually need a priest or a wedding ceremony to be married. Technically, all you needed was to people saying, I take you as my spouse, with witnesses. That was called verbal consent, and for a while, that alone made it official. You could literally be like, hey, we're married now, okay. And if someone overheard you, boom, marriage. This caused a lot of problems, because sometimes people said it jokingly, or under pressure, or after too much ale at the village fair. Then the other person would show up later like, hey, you said we were married, and now we're married, and I want half your goats. To fix this, the church pushed For more formal ceremonies, ideally with a priest and a church and a lot of candles. But the old ways still stuck around for centuries, especially in rural places. Now, about the age thing, you might want to brace yourself. According to medieval church law, the age of consent was shockingly young, 12 for girls, 14 for boysies. You read that right. It wasn't common for marriages to happen that early, but legally, it was allowed. Most people actually married a bit later, teens or early 20s, depending on social class. Girls usually married younger than boys, especially among the nobility, where young brides were basically political pawns. Still, a 14-year-old husband and a 12-year-old wife wasn't unheard of. It sounds bizarre now, but back then, childhood ended early. If you were strong enough to work the fields, you were old enough to marry. And have kids. Scary thought, right? Anyway, back to the rules. Once you were married, could you finally do it? Yes. But only under very specific conditions. Number 1. It had to be for procreation. No babies equals no point, according to church logic. So, if you were older, or infertile, or just not interested in kids, too bad. Number 2. No funny business. Certain positions, certain acts, anything that was considered unnatural, all off limits. Basically, if it looked like you were having fun, the church got suspicious. Number 3. There were a ton of band days. Here's just a sample of when S3X was forbidden. During Lent, 40 days, during Advent, at least 4 weeks on Sundays, because wholly on feast days, which were often the night before receiving communion, while pregnant or breastfeeding, during menstruation, if one spouse was fasting or doing penance. If you add that all up, it's like over half the year, possibly 2/3. Hope you like board games. And don't forget, if you violated any of these rules, you had to confess it, and the priest might assign a few weeks or years of penance. Some church leaders even argued that you should avoid S3X altogether, even in marriage, unless you were specifically trying to make a child. One bishop said that married couples who had S3X without desire for children were as bad as adulterers. Ouch. Still, people found ways around the rules. They snuck in time between harvests, took advantage of quiet nights, and didn't always confess everything. Now let's talk about annulments. Annulments were like medieval divorces, but fancier. You couldn't technically divorce in the eyes of the church, but you could ask them to declare the marriage invalid. This happened for a bunch of reasons. One person was already married. Awkward. They were too closely related. A big issue. They were underage and didn't consent. One person couldn't perform their marital duties. Impotence could get you an annulment. And yes, there were actual court cases where a man had to prove he could function by performing in front of officials. Talk about pressure. So, to sum it up, in the Middle Ages, S3X was legally and religiously tied to marriage. Marriage was controlled by the church. The church had a lot of opinions. And most of those opinions boiled down to, sure, but don't enjoy it too much. But people were still people. They got married young. They got married for love, or land, or politics. They bent the rules. They whispered vows in secret. And once the church caught up, well, then the paperwork began. And that's how you legally did it in medieval times? Kinda makes modern dating apps seem simple, doesn't it? Peasant love and quickie marriages. Tone. Chill, simple, cozy, and lightly humorous. Classic boring history for sleep style. Okay, we've talked about church rules, legal ages, and awkward annulments. But what about the regular people? You know, the folks who didn't live in castles, didn't wear gold robes, and didn't have a bishop breathing down their necks every time they held hands. Let's take a stroll through the muddy lanes of peasant life. You're barefoot, probably itchy, and carrying a chicken under one arm. Welcome to the countryside. Out here, love looked a little different. There were no royal matchmakers, no fancy dowries, no 7-day wedding feasts with roasted swan and dancing troubadours. If you were a peasant, Marriage was usually about survival, not romance, but hey, that didn't stop people from falling in love. Or sneaking kisses behind haystacks. Let's start with how a peasant couple actually got together. There was no Tinder, obviously, and no letters written on rose-scented parchment. Most people grew up in tiny villages, and you knew everyone by age 10. Your options were limited. Your crush was probably someone you'd seen chasing pigs barefoot since childhood. Still, courtship happened. Sometimes it started at a local festival or fair. People danced, drank, and showed off their best wool tunics. If someone caught your eye, you might flirt with some clumsy jokes or offer them a sweet apple. Nothing says medieval romance like slightly sour fruit. Parents sometimes helped arrange things, but not always. Unlike noble families, peasant parents didn't have huge land deals to negotiate. The main concern was whether the couple could afford to live together, a hut, a goat, maybe a few chickens. That's all you really needed to start a household. Now here's where it gets interesting. A lot of couples got married before they were officially married. How? Through something called handfasting. Handfasting was like a DIY wedding. 2. People would join hands, say some vows, and boom, they were a couple. No priest, no witnesses, just mutual consent. It wasn't exactly legal by church standards, but in rural areas, it was common and accepted, and yeah. Hand fasting usually meant the couple started living together and sleeping together, sometimes for weeks or even months before they made it official in the church. In fact, many medieval couples were already expecting a baby by the time they had their church wedding. This wasn't always scandalous, it was just practical. Pregnancy meant the union was fruitful. Everyone liked fruitfulness. One historian even joked that medieval village weddings often involved a baby at the altar and another on the way. The church officially disapproved, of course, but priests in small villages had bigger problems, like keeping the church roof from collapsing or making sure someone showed up for mass. If the people were in love and eventually got married properly, nobody made a fuss. Let's talk about the wedding itself. Peasant weddings were short and simple. Maybe a blessing from the priest, maybe a meal with the family. No expensive dresses or diamond rings. Just your best tunic, a few garlands of flowers, and lots of beer. Lots of beer. Weddings were one of the few chances peasants had to really celebrate. It was like a holiday. There might be music, dancing, bread, cheese, and the chance to eat something other than turnips. But the real event, the bedding ceremony. Now, this one's weird and a little awkward. After the wedding, the couple would be escorted to bed, often by the whole village. Yes, the entire community would literally walk them to their bedroom or blanket-covered straw pile, and sometimes even watch them climb in. Don't worry, they didn't stay to watch anything else, but they might sing a song, throw flower, petals, or offer some friendly encouragement. In some places, witnesses had to confirm the marriage was consummated, which basically means someone had to swear they heard some activity. Charming, right? But once that was done, the couple was officially married in the eyes of the church, the law, and their nosy neighbors. So what was married life like for peasants? Busy, exhausting, and not super romantic. Most peasant couples worked side by side. In the fields, at the loom, tending livestock. Children came quickly and often. Life was short, so people didn't wait around. A woman might give birth to 10 children, though sadly, not all would survive. Privacy was rare. Families lived in one-room huts, often sharing space with animals. If you were lucky, you had a curtain. If not, well, you tried to be quiet. Still, despite the mud and the chickens and the lack of toothpaste, many peasant couples shared real affection. Some even wrote about it, or had songs sung in their honor at festivals. Love wasn't just for nobles with poets and castles. It was for anyone who could sneak a smile while planting turnips. There were, of course, problems. Infidelity, arguments, jealousy, all part of the package. If things got really bad, couples could separate informally, though the church didn't allow divorce. Sometimes, they just stopped living together. Other times, the village mediator, basically the town gossip with power, would step in. But overall, marriage was a team effort. You worked, you loved, you survived. And yes, you probably had S3X when the kids were asleep. If the goat wasn't in the way. So, to wrap up, peasant love was fast, functional, and full of feelings. People got together with a handshake and a promise. They worked hard, married young, and often had kids before the wedding. Their weddings were loud, messy, and full of need. Their bedrooms were shared with chickens, and somehow, it all still worked, because whether you lived in a stone castle or a leaky hut, one thing was true: people were just trying to find someone to share the blankets with. What the nobles were up to. All right, we've peeked into peasant huts. Now let's push open the big wooden doors and step into the fancy halls of the nobility. Everything smells like wax, perfume, and power. The clothes are stiff, the food is weirdly spicy, and everyone's pretending they're not staring at each other's necks. So, what was noble S3X life like? Well, imagine a world where you can't marry for love, but everyone around you is falling into bed with the wrong person. That's pretty much it. First of all, marriage was political. If you were a noble in medieval Europe, you probably didn't get to choose your spouse. Marriages were arranged, not by matchmakers, but by your parents, your king, or whoever wanted to grab more land, money, or power. Your wedding wasn't about romance, it was about alliances. Hey, if my daughter marries your cousin, we both get to share that juicy wheat field by the river. Deal. That's how it worked. You might be 14 and married off to someone twice your age. Or you might be a 30-year-old knight forced to marry a teenager who's barely stopped playing with dolls. Sweet, right. Sometimes, the bride and groom didn't even speak the same language, or meet until the day of the wedding. But don't worry, you didn't have to fall in love with your spouse, because noble culture had something else going on. Enter. Courtly love. If peasant romance was practical, courtly love was pure drama. Think love triangles, poetry, stolen glances, and lots of sighing. Noble men were expected to fall in love with women they couldn't have, often someone else's wife, and then they'd write her poems, dedicate songs to her, or stare at her from across the hall while dramatically eating grapes. The lady, in turn, would play along, dropping hints, giving him a ribbon, maybe inviting him to read a book by candlelight. But of course, they weren't supposed to actually act on it. Courtly love was all about tension, the forbidden kind. Married noble women were expected to be pure and distant. Noble men were expected to be loyal and tortured. In practice, let's just say things got complicated. Affairs were common. Let's be honest, a lot of noble marriages were loveless, political, cold. So, naturally, people looked elsewhere. Kings had mistresses. Queens had favorites. Knights had secret lovers. Even nuns and monks, when they came from noble families, sometimes bent the rules. The church officially condemned adultery. But in noble courts, it was kind of an open secret. Some nobles had multiple lovers. Some even moved them into the castle. In a few cases, royal mistresses were treated almost like second wives, with their own rooms, servants, and even influence over politics. Of course, not everyone got away with it. If you were caught having an affair with the wrong person, like, say, the queen, you could be exiled, imprisoned, or executed. But that didn't stop anyone. Power made people bold, and besides, the risk was half the fun. Famous noble lovers. Let's name drop a few. King Henry II of England had a famous mistress named Rosamund Clifford, also known as Fair Rosamund. His wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine, may or may not have tried to poison her. Medieval love triangle equals yikes. King Philip IV of France's daughters-in-law were accused of having affairs. The scandal was so big, it nearly broke the French royal family. King Edward II had close male favorites, especially a guy named Piers Gaveston, who caused a lot of drama in court. Let's just say Edward's relationship with him was unusually affectionate for a friend. The takeaway: nobles weren't saints, they were people, with titles, and egos, and lots of free time. Kids were part of the plan. Even if you didn't love your spouse, you were expected to have children. Lots of them. Why? Because noble families needed heirs. And backups to the backups. Child mortality was high, and family lines were fragile. So noble women were often married off young and expected to start popping out babies as soon as possible. Pregnancy was basically part of the job description. Some noblemen even kept track of their wives' fertility cycles, or at least tried to. Medieval science wasn't exactly accurate, but the effort was there. And yes, noble women had midwives, herbal remedies, and sometimes even physicians. But childbirth was still risky, really risky. So risky that many noble women wrote out their wills when they got pregnant. Romantic, right? Dressed to impress and hide everything. Fashion in noble circles was complicated. Women wore layers of long, heavy gowns. Men wore tights, tunics, and sometimes shoes so pointy they needed string to hold them up. Underneath, linen, everywhere, corsets and belts and ties. Getting undressed took forever. So if you were planning a secret rendezvous, you needed time and a very patient partner. Still, fashion was used to flirt. Ladies might let their sleeves slip just a little. Men might wear a lady's ribbon on their hat. Every detail had a meaning. Subtle signals, lots of eye contact, and just enough perfume to cover up the fact that no one had bathed since Thursday. Final thoughts: noble S3X life wasn't all about passion. It was about politics, power, appearances, but underneath all the titles and velvet, there were real feelings. Some noble couples did fall in love. Some had strong partnerships. Some ran their lands together and raised families with care. Others were just really good at writing poetry about someone else. So, whether it was whispered confessions in the rose garden or dramatic feasts filled with jealousy, noble romance was a tangled, messy, very human part of medieval life. And if nothing else, at least they had really fancy beds. Virginity, purity, and all that pressure. Virginity. Few words carried as much weight in the Middle Ages, especially if you were a woman. If you were a man, people mostly shrug. But if you were a woman, your virginity wasn't just personal, it was a public matter. Like, full-on family business, church business, sometimes even courtroom business. Yup. Welcome to medieval pressure. Let's take a breath and unpack it all. Virgin equals pure equals holy equals good girl. In medieval Christian thinking, virginity was seen as the highest form of purity, especially for women. The church taught that S3X was inherently tied to sin, so if you hadn't had it yet, you were spiritually clean. This idea came straight from early saints and church leaders, who praised virgin martyrs and holy women for resisting temptation, and often dying for it. Some saints even cut off their hair or disfigured themselves so they wouldn't be desirable. Grim stuff. So, being a virgin wasn't just about not having S3X, it was a whole identity, a whole status. And if you kept it for life, even better. Nuns were often referred to as brides of Christ. Virginity made them closer to the divine. The holier you were, the less your body was supposed to matter. Basically, the less action you got, the closer to heaven you were. For future wives, it was non-negotiable if you were a woman expected to marry, especially if your family was noble or wealthy. Being a virgin at the altar was mandatory, like, seriously mandatory, because virginity wasn't just a personal virtue. It was proof of your family's honor, your loyalty, your value as a bride. Some even saw it as proof that any future children would truly belong to the husband. No pressure. Right. There are cases where grooms backed out of marriages because the bride wasn't pure. Some families paid to have midwives or witnesses verify the wedding night's results. As in, people would check the bed sheets for blood. Yeah, that was a real thing. And if there wasn't any, questions started flying, rumors, accusations, sometimes even lawsuits. Quick side note, the whole bloody sheet equals virginity thing is not reliable. Science says nope, but medieval folks didn't have Google. So here we are, testing virginity. Don't try this at home. You'd think people would just take your word for it. But no, the Middle Ages came up with some wild ways to test whether a girl was still a virgin. These included checking her urine, looking into her eyes, watching how she walked, pressing on her stomach, or, most awkwardly of all, physical exam by a midwife or expert. None of these were accurate. Most were just excuses to judge women unfairly. But in a world obsessed with reputation, people clung to any sign they could find. Some women were even accused of losing their virginity because they rode horses too often, or danced too much, or fell down. Spoiler again, that's not how it works. For men, not so much. Let's talk double standards. While women were expected to be virgins, men were often given a free pass. Boys might visit a brothel before marriage. They might even brag about it. And while the church technically disapproved, people kind of looked the other way. If a man had experience, it wasn't seen as shameful, it was seen as normal, or even healthy. But if a woman had experience, judgment, shame, even legal trouble, that's the double standard in full medieval glory. Virgin saints and holy role models. Church didn't just expect regular women to be virgins. It celebrated those who stayed that way forever. Virgin saints were everywhere. Saint Agnes, Saint Cecilia, Saint Lucy, Saint Catherine of Alexandria, who supposedly debated pagan scholars, refused marriage, and converted a bunch of people before being executed. Their stories were often brutal. Many were tortured or killed for refusing S3X or marriage. But these tales were told again and again, especially to young girls. The message was clear: be like them, pure, holy, untouched, even if it kills you. Cheerful bedtime story. Right, the fantasy of the eternal virgin. In some noble circles, virginity became fashionable, especially among young women in court. It was mysterious, desirable, and tied to ideals of grace and beauty. Even after marriage, some women were celebrated as eternal virgins if they died young or were thought to have been too pure to enjoy S3X. In poems and paintings, they were shown with lila, symbol of purity, white gowns, and long, loose hair, which was only acceptable for virgins to wear uncovered in public. Virginity was practically a brand, and if you lost it, if a woman had S3X before marriage, willingly or not, her life could change dramatically. She might be disowned by her family, unable to marry, forced into a convent, publicly shamed, or worse, punished by law. And sadly, consent didn't always matter. Women who were assaulted still faced blame. If a nobleman seduced or forced a servant, the servant often got the harsher consequence. Justice wasn't exactly fair or kind. The pressure was real. So, let's recap. In medieval times, virginity equals power. For women, losing it equals danger. Unless you had a ring and a priest, testing it equals invasive and unreliable. Double standards equals everywhere, and purity. It was idealized, weaponized, and deeply misunderstood. But underneath all that pressure, all those expectations, people were still just people. They fell in love, made mistakes, got scared, hoped no one found out, and sometimes they just wanted to be seen as more than a sheet on the wedding night. Because at the end of the day, virginity wasn't really about S3X, it was about control. And the medieval world was very good at using it. S3X education. Medieval style **. Alright. Time for the big question. How did medieval people learn about S3X? Spoiler alert, not from school, no health class, no diagrams, no banana and condom demonstration, nope. In medieval Europe, S3X education was more like a strange game of telephone, passed down through whispers, guesses, and a whole lot of bad advice. Let's step back into that world and see just how confusing things got, the birds and the bees. But make it medieval. Most medieval parents didn't sit their kids down for a big talk about the birds and the bees. In fact, for many, S3X was just not something you talked about directly, especially not with your children. So, how did people learn? Whispers from older siblings, gossip among friends, peeking at what the animals were doing in the barn, church sermons warning about sin, weird little books hidden in the library. It wasn't the most reliable education system. If you were lucky, someone might tell you something helpful before your wedding night. But honestly, a lot of people walked into adulthood with no idea how their own bodies worked. Medieval instruction manuals now. Just because there weren't schools for this stuff doesn't mean there weren't books. In fact, medieval Europe had a handful of S3X manuals and medical texts that claimed to explain the facts of life. Some were based on ancient Greek and Roman ideas, others were written by monks or doctors, and almost all of them were very weird. Here's a taste. Some books claimed that men had hotter bodies and women were colder, which explained why men were more active and women were more moist. Yes, moist. Sorry. Others insisted that women needed to reach climax in order to get pregnant. Spoiler, that's not how it works, but medieval folks truly believed it for centuries. There were also warnings about having S3X during a full moon, or when the wind was blowing the wrong way, or on certain days of the week. Because obviously, Tuesday was bad luck for baby making. What did they actually think was going on? Brace yourself, because medieval science had some bold theories. Here are a few actual beliefs from the time. Women's wombs could wander around the body if they weren't satisfied. This was called wandering womb syndrome. Real theory, very fake condition. Semen was made from blood and brain power, not how biology works, but okay. A child's personality could be shaped by the position the parents were in during conception. Want a brave son? There's a pose for that. Want a gentle daughter? Try a different one. It was part science, part folklore, and part total nonsense. But remember, this was the best knowledge available. So people took it seriously. Mirrors, dreams, and other lessons. Some folks believed that you could learn about S3X through dreams. If you had certain kinds of visions, it was said to be your body's way of teaching you what you needed to know. There were also superstitions about seeing your future spouse in the mirror, or having prophetic dreams on certain saints' days. As for practical experience, for many people, their first real lesson in S3X came on their wedding night, in a candlelit room, with a priest or midwife sometimes waiting outside the door to make sure things happened. No pressure. What did the church say? Ah yes, the church. The medieval church talked a lot about S3X, mostly about what not to do. S3X before marriage. Sin, adultery. Sin, lustful thoughts. Sin, too much enthusiasm during S3X. Also, a sign, enjoying it too much, even with your spouse. You guessed it. Sin. Basically, the church believed that S3X was only okay if it was between a married man and woman, done for the purpose of making babies. Anything else was off limits. But here's the twist. Some monks and priests wrote extremely detailed lists of forbidden acts, which accidentally taught people exactly what those acts were. Talk about reverse psychology. Funny manuals. Real edition of the most famous S3X related books from the Middle Ages was the Secretum Secretorum, The Secret of Secrets. It claimed to be advice from Aristotle to Alexander the Great, and it covered everything from food to astrology too. You guessed it. Bedroom tips. It suggested avoiding S3X when you're too full, not doing it on the floor bad for your back, apparently, and always choosing the right time of year. Summer was too hot, winter too cold. Basically, Goldilocks logic, another famous one, the Trotula, written by a female physician, or at least attributed to one. It gave advice on women's health, fertility, and even cosmetics. While parts of it were helpful, others were, let's just say, medically questionable. And what about the peasants? Okay, not everyone had access to fancy books. So, how did the average person learn? They watched animals. Seriously, that's how a lot of people picked up the basics. If you grew up on a farm, you saw cows, pigs, goats, doing what nature intended? It gave you a rough idea. The rest you picked up from older folks. Jokes, songs, or trial and error. And honestly, some people just figured it out when the moment came. Simple, clumsy, human. Final thoughts. Medieval S3X education wasn't exactly a guided journey. It was more like being handed a map drawn in crayon, upside down, during a thunderstorm, and yet, people still found their way. They fumbled, guessed, whispered, and giggled their way through the mystery of it all, because even in a world of wandering wombs and moon warnings, one truth stayed the same: people have always been curious, and when curiosity meets candlelight, well, history gets awkward. The Church vs. S3X spoiler, it's complicated. The medieval church, on the surface, it seemed pretty clear where it stood on S3X. Don't, or at least, don't enjoy it too much. Don't do it in weird ways. Don't think about it. And definitely don't talk about it unless it's a warning. But here's the twist. While the church was often strict, it was also deeply obsessed with S3X, wrote entire books about it, obsessed. So let's tiptoe through this weird, holy maze of shame, sin, loopholes, and sermons. The basic rule, baby making on live. General message from the church was, S3X is only acceptable inside marriage, and only for the purpose of having children. No love letters, no pillow talk, no fun. If we're being honest, even then, it had to be between a man and a woman, with the man on top at the right time of the month and with zero signs of excessive enthusiasm. Too much fun. That was lust. And lust was a deadly sin. This wasn't about romance. It was about control. Since Scorker Deers, how things were often ranked by medieval moralists. Married S3X for kids. Technically okay. Married S3X for pleasure. Risky. S3X outside marriage. Sinful. Masturbation. Super sinful. Adultery. Definitely sinful. Same S3X activity. Seen as a major sin. Any non-standard positions. Yep. Also sin. There were even handbooks for confessors, priests who heard confessions, listing exactly what people might have done, so the right penance could be assigned. Some of these confession manuals were surprisingly specific, almost like the authors were a little too familiar with the material. The virgin ideals we covered before. Virginity was held up as the gold standard of purity, especially for women. But it wasn't just about physical innocence. The church also idealized celibacy, especially for clergy, monks, priests, bishops. They were supposed to give up S3X entirely. Nuns too. This led to the idea that not having S3X made you closer to God, like you were above earthly desires, holier, more spiritual. Which sounds noble, but also kinda miserable. Saints who said no thanks. Some of the most celebrated saints in the medieval church were people who resisted S3X at all costs, like Saint Agnes, martyred for refusing to marry or sleep with a Roman official. Saint Cecilia converted her husband to Christianity and took a vow of chastity. Saint Catherine of Siena lived her whole life as a virgin and refused marriage. These stories were told again and again, often to young girls. The message: the holiest people say no. No wonder everyone grew up with complicated feelings about their bodies. S3X, a necessary evil leaven inside marriage. S3X was sometimes seen as something to be endured, not enjoyed. Theologians, like St. Augustine, believed that original sin thinks Adam and Eve meant humans had out-of-control urges, especially during S3X. The only reason it was allowed was because, well, babies had to come from somewhere. This led to a mindset where S3X was like medicine. You didn't do it for fun. You did it because it was necessary. Romantic. Huh? Traps and loopholes. No. Not everyone was a strict rule follower. Even some priests and monks bent the rules, or found the loopholes. Some wrote long, poetic love letters. Others secretly visited brothels. More on that in a later chapter. Some clergy had housekeepers who were clearly more than just housekeepers. The church officially forbade this, but enforcement was inconsistent. Some popes had mistresses, some bishops had kids, and as long as they kept up appearances, many were left alone. So yeah, a little hypocritical. Confession and clean slates in way medieval folks dealt with all this guilt. Confession, if you sinned, which, let's face it, most people did, you could go to a priest, confess your acts, and receive penance. This might mean saying a bunch of prayers, giving to the poor, going on a pilgrimage, fasting for a few days, then, poof, your soul was clean again, at least until next time. Confession became a cycle. Sin, confess, repeat. The church didn't love that pattern, but it did make people feel a bit better. Monks who wrote the rule books. Many of the rules about S3X came from monks and theologians, people who weren't supposed to be doing it themselves. Which is ironic. Writers like Thomas Aquinas, Peter Lombard, St. Jerome wrote huge volumes on sin, marriage, lust, temptation, and all things bodily. Aquinas especially loved categorizing things. He ranked sins from not great to you're going straight to hell. He had firm opinions on positions, timing, and intent. These books became the moral guides for generations. What about regular people? Most peasants weren't reading Aquinas. They just tried to follow the basics. Don't mess around too much. Try not to get caught. Confess when you mess up, and hope the priest wasn't too nosy. The truth is, many people just quietly ignored the stricter rules. They had relationships, secret affairs, flings, heartbreaks, because they were human, and while guilt lingered in the background, life went on. Final thoughts. Medieval church and S3X had a very complicated relationship. It preached purity, but obsessed over sin. It banned desire, but wrote about it constantly. It held people to high standards, while quietly forgiving the powerful. At its core, the church wanted to regulate desire, to put boundaries around something deeply human, but no matter how many rules they made, S3X kept happening, because no amount of sermons could fully erase the fact that people fell in love, got curious, made mistakes, and sometimes just gave in to the momentan maybe. Just maybe. That's what made them human. Brothels, bathhouses, and red light realities. Okay. So, we've talked about church rules, marriage, forbidden desires. But what about the places where people just ignored all of that? Yep. We're talking about brothels and bathhouses, the not-so-secret underbelly of medieval cities. Despite all the fire and brimstone, these places were very popular, so pull on your softest tunic and grab a towel. We're heading to the steamy side of town. Welcome to the medieval red light district. Most major cities had designated areas where S3X work was, if not officially encouraged, at least tolerated. These districts were close enough for easy access, far enough from churches and markets, usually tucked away near rivers or town gates. In London, it was Southwark, just across the river. In Paris, Rue Gravois. In many towns, these neighborhoods had names like Stew Lane or Gropkent Lane. Yes, really. Not exactly subtle. Inside a brothel. So, what did a brothel actually look like? Forget the Hollywood version. Most medieval brothels were modest wooden buildings candlelit and smoky, decorated with faded cloth, cheap furniture, and maybe a cat or t'other might be, a madam or manager, often a former worker herself. A few women living and working there, a back room for, well, business. Prices varied. So did rules. Some brothels had regulars, some were more chaotic, some were cleaner than others. Hygiene wasn't exactly a strong point, but make no mistake, this was a full-blown business. Who was running this show? Surprise! In many cases, local governments were involved. Cities realized they couldn't stop the demand, so they decided to control it instead. That meant licensing brothels, charging taxes or fees, appointing officials to monitor the morals of the area, setting official rules like no working on Sundays. Some towns even had city-run brothels. Yippee, basically, municipal PRON. The idea was that it would protect women and keep things orderly. Spoiler, it didn't always work that way. The bathhouse scene. No, let's talk about bathhouses. The medieval combo of spa, social, club, and possible hookup spot. People went to bathhouses too. Clean themselves, sort of relax in hot water, hang out with friends, get massages, and sometimes get a little extra attention. Not every bathhouse was naughty, but a lot of them had dual purposes. They were usually co-ed. You'd rent a little wooden tub, soak with herbs, maybe have a glass of wine, and if things went a certain direction, well, no one asked too many questions. Fun fact, bathhouses in Germany were called Badstube, and were known for being steamy in more ways than one. Who went to brothels? You might assume it was just bored nobles or rowdy knights, but nope. Everyone went. Peasants who saved a few coins, merchants passing through, monks who couldn't resist temptation, young men learning the ropes before marriage, soldiers. Levite was seen, in a weird way, as part of growing up. Some parents even sent their sons to a brothel to become a man. Awkward, but common. Legal. But shameful. Here's the wild part. While brothels were legal in many places, being a S3X worker was still seen as morally bad. Women who worked in these places were not allowed to marry respectable. Men barred from certain religious services, often forced to wear distinctive clothing like yellow hoods or striped dresses, buried in separate cemeteries. So they existed in this weird gray zone. Needed, taxed, used, but always judged. The workers themselves. Let's pause here. Behind all the medieval smirking and jokes, these were real people. Most S3X workers were women. Many had no other options. They were poor, orphaned, abandoned, or escaping worse situations like abusive marriages. Some chose the work for independence or survival. Others were coerced or trapped. It wasn't glamorous. It could be dangerous, especially without protection from clients or corrupt officials. Still, some found ways to build community, support each other, and even save up for a new life. There were stories of women who left brothels to become innkeepers, midwives, or even respected elders in their towns. The church's weird relationship. So what did the church think of all this? Officially, bad, sinful, immoral. Unofficially, tolerated. In fact, theologians like St. Thomas Aquinas argued that brothels were a necessary evil. Better to have public outlets for lust than let men commit worse sins like rape or adultery. Some monks even used brothels. Others preached outside them. It was hypocrisy wrapped in incense. The occasional moral cleanup. Every now and then, a ruler or bishop would try to clean up the city. This usually meant closing brothels, forcing bathhouses to separate the sexes, arresting workers, burning down immoral districts. But it rarely lasted. Within months, things reopened, sometimes just around the corner, because as strict as laws got, demand never disappeared. Final thought. So, what was the medieval red light reality? It was complicated, messy, contradictory, just like everything else about that era. Brothels and bathhouses were places of escape, survival, business, and often quiet heartbreak. For all the sermons and shame, people still craved connection, comfort, and closeness. And in these steamy, flickering corners of medieval towns. They found it, even just for a night. So, if you're drifting off now, picture the candlelight glowing on old wooden walls, steam rising from a warm tub, laughter echoing in the distance. Another chapter closed. Medieval kinks, fantasies, and forbidden pleasures. Alright, let's be honest, people have always been weird, and medieval folks, oh, they were no exception. Beneath the layers of linen, behind the church doors and candle-lit windows, human imagination ran wild, just like it always has. Tonight, we're tiptoeing into the world of fantasies, fetishes, and the strange side of medieval pleasure. No judgment, just curiosity, and maybe a few confused eyebrows. Let's go. Wait, medieval people had kinks. Oh yeah. Even with the church breathing down everyone's necks, desire didn't just disappear. It got creative, or sneaky, or both. People still had preferences, fetishes, daydreams, secret wants, and while they didn't always talk openly about them, we can find clues hidden in court records, poems, and songs, confession manuals. Naughty art. Yes, there's a lot and weirdly specific sermons warning people what not to do. It usually meant someone was definitely doing it. Feet, hair, and other soft spots. Let's start simple. Some medieval writings mention fetishes we'd recognize today, like feet, or long hair, or certain fabrics. These might seem tame, but back then, even ankles were considered scandalous. Hair, for example, was a major symbol of beauty and sensuality. Women often covered their hair after marriage, but some men were really into it, like poetry level into it. There's even a story of a man stealing a lock of a woman's hair and keeping it hidden in his shirt. Medieval romance, folks. As for feet, some love poems got weirdly detailed about sandals, toes, and dainty steps. Honestly, not much has changed. BDSM, sort of. Now, did people explore domination, submission, or pain-pleasure dynamics in the Middle Ages? Yes, though they wouldn't have used those words. We see hints of this in erotic art showing playful spanking or restraint, court cases involving role-play gone too far, confessions about enjoying punishment a little too much of, in religious practices like self-flagellation, whipping oneself for penance may have blurred the line between suffering and strange satisfaction, at least in some minds. Again, human psychology doesn't just hit pause because it's the 1300s. Role-play, not just for noble shares something fun. Medieval folks loved costumes. And not just at parties. Festivals like Carnival let people dress up, cross-dress, and act out secret fantasies in public, masked and anonymous. Once the wine flowed, lines got blurry. There are also records of servant-master role-play night and damsel fantasies, and of course, clerical confessions where the priest suddenly isn't just listening. Some of this happened in brothels, some behind closed doors. Some ended up in church court. It's messy and real. Animal fantasies, not what you think. Usually, medieval art and literature loved mixing S3X with animal imagery, not in a bestiality way, though sadly, that did happen, and was heavily punished, but more symbolically. For example, lions equals strong, passionate lovers. Goats equals wild, lusty behavior. Snakes equals temptation and desire. But then, things got weird. Some stories included enchanted lovers turning into animals. Others used werewolf metaphors for wild, forbidden passion. There was one tale where a knight's mistress gave birth to a child with dog ears. No one really explained that part. The line between fantasy and fairy tale got pretty blurry. Confession manuals, the unexpected K&K cataloguers, where it gets juicy. Priests used confession handbooks to guide them on how to question people about their sins. These books are supposed to be moral guides, but some of them sound like low-budget fan fiction. They asked questions like, did you ever take pleasure in being beaten? Have you imagined yourself as someone of the opposite gender during S3X? Have you acted like an animal while committing the sin of lechery? Father, Are you sure this is for spiritual purposes? Historians now use these manuals to understand just how diverse and imaginative medieval intimacy could be. Because behind every "don't do this" is someone who did. The church and thought crime-esque medieval church wasn't just worried about actions. They were deeply concerned with what people were thinking. Lustful thoughts. Sinful. Dreams you couldn't control. Still sinful. Fantasizing about someone while sleeping next to your spouse. Big sin. This led to a lot of internal guilt and a lot of whispered secrets in confessional booths. Some monks even wrote about their own struggles with impure dreams and desires. The harder they tried to suppress them, the weirder they seemed to get. Turns out repression, ain't great for the imagination. Folk magic and love spells in villages and countryside towns. Not everyone turned to the church for answers. Some turned to magic. They were love charms, aphrodisiac potions, and yes, spells designed to make someone fall in lust with you. Ingredients could include herbs like mandrake or fennel, animal parts, don't ask, and strange rituals involving candles, hair, or moonlight. Were they effective? Probably not. But the belief itself, that passion could be summoned, shows how important desire was. Even in everyday peasant life, people didn't just want to survive. They wanted to feel something, not marginally. And finally, medieval art. Ever seen a medieval manuscript with monks carefully copying scripture? Now imagine them doodling little private scenes in the margins. Seriously, there are real books with naked figures chasing snails, people with genitals growing out of trees, monks mooning each other, and animals doing unspeakable things. Maybe boredom, maybe humor, maybe suppressed urges leaking out. But one thing's for sure, someone thought about it, then drew it, then kept drawing. Final thought. So yeah, medieval people had kinks, they had fantasies, strange dreams, private tastes, and quiet thrills, just like we do today. The difference, most of it happened in shadows, behind veils, under layers of guilt and whispers. But even with the fear, the shame, the rules and rituals, desire still found a way. So as you drift off, picture this: a candle flickers in the dark, a scroll half hidden beneath a bed, laughter from behind a mask at the town festival, a quiet heartbeat, full of curiosity, and someone, somewhere, dreaming a dream they weren't supposed to dream. Women's pleasure and why it was a big medieval mystery. Alright, let's talk about something medieval folks didn't really want to talk about: women's pleasure, specifically, whether it mattered. Or, honestly, whether it even existed. It's one of those awkward topics that floated around medieval society like a confused ghost, half ignored, half feared, and very poorly understood. But don't worry, we're not here to judge medieval people, okay? Maybe just a little. We're just here to explore what they thought, what they missed, and what they got hilariously wrong. Let's get into it. Step 1. Did they know it was a thing? Short answer, kind of, but they weren't sure what to do with the idea. See, medieval writers, mostly men, surprise, surprise, were very focused on men's pleasure. It was easy to measure, obvious, and tied to fertility, which was super important for continuing bloodlines. But women's pleasure, that was confusing. Some doctors thought it mattered for reproduction. Others said it didn't. Some priests said it was dangerous. Others said it was fine, as long as it happened quietly. And a few poets acted like it was this magical mystery no man could ever fully understand. They weren't entirely wrong. The weird science of it all back then, people didn't have microscopes or anatomy textbooks. Instead, they had guesses and ancient Greek scrolls and vibes. Many medieval thinkers believed in something called the one-sex model. In this idea, men and women had the same internal parts, just arranged differently. A woman's reproductive organs were like an inverted version of a man's. Women had seed too, and needed to climax in order to get pregnant. So, in that model, female pleasure was necessary, which is kind of progressive. in a wildly wrong sort of way. But then came the church, and they weren't too thrilled about people enjoying themselves. The church's take, guilty until proven wholly for medieval church leaders, pleasure in general was suspicious. Women's pleasure, even more so. Why? Because women were seen as emotionally weaker, spiritually fragile, more easily tempted by the flesh, basically walking temptation wrapped in a dress. So if a woman admitted to enjoying herself too much, it meant she was maybe a little sinful. Priests encouraged modesty, submission, and obedience. A woman was supposed to lie still, say her prayers, and do her duty. If she liked it too much, that might mean she was lustful, which could mean she was dangerous, which could mean she was a witch. Yeah, it escalated fast. Pleasure and witchcraft didn't help that female pleasure was sometimes associated with magic or the devil. Some inquisitors believed witches had S3X with demons, used herbs to make themselves more lustful, could steal male seed, or cause impotence with their power. Sand if a woman seemed confident in bed, or talked about her own body, or enjoyed her husband's company a little too much, that could raise suspicions. So for many women, especially outside noble circles, it was safer to stay quiet. Desire became something you hid, not explored. But wait. Some people got in it. Everyone was clueless. There were a few medical writers, even male ones, who admitted that women could and should enjoy S3X. Some wrote about the CL Taurus, though not always by name, and suggested that stimulating it could help with conception. They were also midwives, healers, and wise women who knew a lot more about female bodies than most male doctors. And then there were poets, especially in places like southern France and Italy, where female troubadours called troubadours wrote love songs from a woman's point of view, talking about longing, heartbreak, and yes, desire. So the knowledge was there, it just wasn't always welcomed. In the bedroom, it varied a lot. Let's be real. Not every medieval bedroom was cold and silent. Some couples did care about each other. Some men did try to please their wives. Some women even talked openly about what they wanted, especially in private diaries or love letters. In brothels, experienced women often taught younger ones about pleasure, how to fake it, how to feel it, and how to protect themselves emotionally. In noble courts, women sometimes used their power to demand pleasure, especially if they had influence or lovers of their own. And among peasants, well, they had less theory, more practice, which probably helped. Cultural clues, songs, jokes, and a wink even if official texts were shy about women's pleasure. Everyday culture wasn't. Folk songs joked about eager young wives and lazy husbands. Tavern humor hinted at women who knew what they liked, and naughty plays sometimes featured clever women tricking priests or noblemen into satisfying them. Was it always respectful? No, but it proves one thing. People knew. They just weren't supposed to say it out loud. Final thoughts. In the end, medieval women's pleasure wasn't a total mystery. It was just treated like one, pushed aside, whispered about, hidden under layers of guilt and superstition, but it still existed. In the quiet corners of marriage beds, in love poems passed between hands, in the smirk of a peasant girl who knew more than her priest ever would. So tonight, let's remember, even in a world of silence and shame, curiosity found a way. And pleasure, real, honest, human pleasure, was never truly lost. It was just misunderstood. Queer love in the Middle Ages, hidden, forbidden, but still there. Asterisk. So far, we've talked a lot about medieval love, marriage, and all the complicated stuff in between. But there's a side of the story that's often left out of the history books, or worse, buried on purpose. Tonight, we're lighting a candle and opening that secret door, because queer love did exist in the Middle Ages. It wasn't always safe. It wasn't always easy. But it was real. Let's take a closer look at the lives, loves, and quiet courage of people who didn't fit the traditional medieval mold, even if they had to hide it. A culture of silence. Let's start with the obvious. The Middle Ages weren't exactly LGBTQ friendly. The church had strict teachings, governments passed harsh laws, and anyone who didn't fit into the neat box of man plus woman equals babies was at risk of punishment, exile, or worse. But, and this is important, that doesn't mean queer people didn't exist. They just had to live in the gaps, between the lines, behind the curtains, inside coded letters and clever poems. The silence wasn't proof of absence. It was a survival strategy. Love letters, cloaks, and code words. Even with the danger, some queer people found ways to connect and even express their love. For example, there are surviving love poems between monks in medieval monasteries. Written in Latin, they're emotional, romantic, and sometimes even steamy, just hidden under religious language. In noble courts, some women formed what were basically emotional and romantic partnerships with each other, sometimes called sworn sisterhoods. In cities like Florence, coded slang developed to talk about queer desire without saying it outright. Think of it like medieval gay lingo. And there were other clues. Art showing same-sex affection trial records from people caught in the act. Private diaries with gender-fluid language. Every little scrap reminds us they were here. The church. Harsh rules. But some double standards. The church officially condemned all same S3X activity, calling it sodomy, which was a very broad term for anything that wasn't man on woman, married, and focused on making babies. Punishments ranged from public shaming to imprisonment, and sometimes execution. Yikes. But weirdly, there were also loopholes. For instance, close male friendships were totally fine, as long as they looked platonic. Monasteries were filled with men living together, often for life. Female convents allowed for emotional spiritual friendships that got very intense, very fast. So, a lot of passion could hide behind holy words. No one really asked questions, unless things got too obvious. Gender bending. Let us know. Let's talk about gender nonconformity, because not everyone in the Middle Ages felt at home in the gender they were assigned at birth. Some people lived as the opposite gender. Full-time wore clothes traditionally meant for another gender, took on names and jobs that didn't match the rules. One famous case is Eleanor Rykener, a 14th century person in England who presented as a woman and worked as an embroiderer, and also as a S3X worker with both men and women. When Eleanor was arrested, court records showed confusion more than anger. Is this a man or a woman? They asked. The real answer: both, maybe, or neither, or something more fluid. But Eleanor's story proves one thing clearly: gender expression wasn't always black and white. Even then, theater, festivals, and play. Strangely enough, public spaces sometimes allowed for queer expression. Temporarily, during festivals like Carnival, people cross-dressed, kissed whoever they wanted, and acted out fantasy roles. It was like medieval Mardi Gras. Everything turned upside down, at least for a day. In theater, men played female roles, sometimes with a surprising amount of flair. Some performances even joked about gender and S3X in ways that seem pretty queer. By today's standards, it didn't mean people could live that way full-time, but it gave them a moment, a break from pretending, a breath. Queer life in cities. Be the late Middle Ages. Cities like Florence, London, and Paris had growing urban populations, and with them, underground queer communities. There were private meeting places for men to hook up or socialize. Rumors of lesbian households in certain neighborhoods. Networks of people who looked out for each other, passed along signals, and kept secrets. Authorities tried to crack down, and sometimes did, but they couldn't catch everyone. Love and desire aren't easy to police. Even with an army of priests and laws, the risks were real, not sugar-coated. Being openly queer in medieval Europe could be dangerous. People were shamed in public, forced to confess, tortured, even burned at the stake in the worst cases. In some towns, sodomites were literally banned from entering. In others, men caught with other men were castrated or hanged. It's heartbreaking, and it's why so many queer stories were never written down or were destroyed, but some still survived. Some were whispered from one person to the next, and some were hidden in plain sight. Quiet acts of resistance. Medieval people resisted in small, powerful ways, by living authentically, even if only in private, by loving each other, even when no one else would, by writing poems, leaving clues, or simply existing when the world said no. They might not have called themselves gay or trans or queer. Those words didn't exist yet, but their feelings, their identities, their longing, very real, very human, very brave. Final thought. So here's what we've learned. Queer love in the Middle Ages wasn't loud. It wasn't safe. It wasn't always visible, but it was there, hidden in letters, cloaked in poetry, passed through glances in candlelit halls, and the fact that these stories survived at all, that's kind of a miracle. As you drift off tonight, imagine this: two monks exchanging secret notes, a woman in armor living as herself, a hidden kiss in a crowded festival street, all reminders that even in the quietest centuries, love still found a way. The business of lust, brothels, pimps, and the S3X economy of medieval towns. All right. So far, we've tiptoed through bedrooms, monasteries, and love letters. But now it's time to visit a whole different world. Welcome to the medieval brothel. Yes, they existed. Yes, they were often officially approved. And yes, they made a lot of money. Because while medieval society loved to pretend it was pure and holy, deep down, it still had needs, and those needs, they kept entire parts of the local economy spinning. Let's talk about how lust became business, and how that business shaped cities, morals, and medieval life itself. Setting the scene: lust in the marketplace. Imagine a bustling medieval town, muddy streets, horses clopping, traders yelling, church bells ringing, and just off to the side, a street with a few special houses. Welcome to the red light district. Though they didn't call it that yet, these areas were tucked away, but not too hidden, full of inns, taverns, and brothels watched closely by city officials and clergy. Because as long as you kept it contained, prostitution was tolerated, sometimes even taxed. That's right. In many towns, brothels were licensed. The city got a cut. Morality took a backseat to money. Official brothels? Yes, real liliths. Be clear, many medieval cities ran their own brothels. Think of them like public utilities, just more awkward. Cities like London, Paris, and Cologne had official houses of pleasure. They were managed by hired madams regularly inspected for cleanliness, and other things protected by law, to some extent. Goal: control the chaos, keep men from harassing respectable women, prevent unlicensed streetwalkers from wandering. And, of course, collect taxes. The women, workers, not always willing glaze meet the real stars of the show, the working women of the brothel. These weren't rich courtesans or glamorous queens. They were often poor abandoned orphans, widows, or thus desperate for coin. Some entered the trade willingly, hoping to make fast money. Others were tricked, pressured, or outright sold. Once inside, life was hard. You had to pay rent to the brothel, pay for your clothes, your food, even your bedding, and deal with drunk, violent, or rude clients, and you couldn't leave whenever you wanted. Many brothels functioned like debt traps. So while it was technically a job, it wasn't always a choice. Enter the pimps and other helpers. Behind many brothels stood a man, or several, who took a cut. These men went by many names: bawds, pimps, guardians, protectors. Their jobs included bringing in customers, recruiting new women, offering minimal protection, collecting payments. In some towns, pimps weren't legal. In others, they worked with the city. Either way, they usually made more than the women did. There were also female brothel owners, often former S3X workers themselves. Some were surprisingly powerful, even respected. But society still judged them, especially if they made too much money or got to bold cleanliness and disease. the public health excuse. Let's talk about syphilis and gonorrhea and a bunch of medieval illnesses that didn't have names yet. S3X transmitted infections ran rampant, and brothels were blamed, but also used to manage the risk. Some cities mandated regular health checks, kind of had rules about who could work and when, closed down houses during outbreaks temporarily, of course. They didn't fully understand how diseases worked, but they knew something was spreading, and regulating brothels felt like a way to control it. So ironically, the same places they called sinful were also part of their health policy. The church's complicated stance. And here's where things get even more tangled. The church officially condemned prostitution. It was a sin, a shame, a fall from virtue. But if it was necessary to prevent men from worse sins, like assault or adultery, then maybe it was a lesser evil. Some theologians argued that brothels were like sewers, gross, but important for public hygiene, charming, right? And while some bishops cracked down on vice, others looked the other way, especially if the church owned the land the brothel was on. Yes, that happened. God works in mysterious ways. Brothels in pop culture. Medieval people weren't blind to the weirdness. They wrote satirical plays about corrupt brothel keepers, jokes about monks visiting the girls, poems where lust was both celebrated and punished. In many of these stories, the brothel was a stage for hypocrisy, power games, and just a little cause. It wasn't just about S3X. It was about class, money, and survival. And medieval people knew it. Beyond the walls, streetwalkers and unofficial trade. Not all S3X work happened in licensed brothels. There were streetwalkers who waited near taverns and markets, tavern girls who served beer and other things, private arrangements where wealthy men kept mistresses in secret apartments. These women were even more vulnerable. No protection, no rules, just the risk of arrest, or worse still, many survived. Some even thrived, because in a world that didn't offer many options, you took what you could get. Final thought. So, what have we learned tonight? Medieval brothels weren't just dens of sin, they were part of the system, built into the economy, managed by the state, whispered about by priests, and lived in by real people, with real hopes, fears, debts, and dreams. The S3X trade in medieval times wasn't glamorous, but it was there, woven into the city's rhythm like any other trade, and while the workers weren't always respected, their labor, it kept the town moving. Literally. So tonight, if your dreams take you past torchlit alleyways and rowdy taverns, just remember, behind every closed door was a story, a negotiation, a survival. And maybe, just maybe, a little moment of humanity. Forbidden affairs, scandal, adultery, and getting caught in medieval times. Let's be honest. No matter the time period, humans have a habit of breaking the rules when it comes to love, or, let's say, love. In medieval times, marriage was sacred, adultery was a sin, honor was everything. But despite all that, people still cheated, a lot. And when they got caught, oh boy, that's when things got dramatic. So tonight, let's sneak through castle halls and peek behind cottage doors to find out just how risky and exciting forbidden love could be in the Middle Ages. Why cheat? Medieval marriages weren't always about romance. Most were arranged for politics, for land, for money, or because your parents said so and you had no say in the matter. So it's not surprising that emotional affairs and secret flings were common, especially among the nobility. But it wasn't just about being bored. Sometimes it was about control, desire, or lust, feeling seen. Especially for women, whose lives were often tightly controlled, an affair could feel like a tiny act of rebellion. Risky, yes, but sometimes totally worth it. Nobles behaving badly. Let's start at the top. Kings and queens were supposed to be paragons of virtue, but many of them were hot messes. King Philip IV of France accused his daughters-in-law of adultery and sparked a massive scandal. Queen Isabella of England had an affair with a rebel knight, helped overthrow her husband, and basically ran the country for a while. Countesses, dukes, and bishops all had their fair share of secret lovers. Some even kept hidden rooms for, private meetings. The elite had more privacy and money, but they also had more people watching, servants, advisors, nosy monks. So getting caught, it happened a lot. And when it did, it could ruin reputations, or worse, in the villages, gossip and consequence for common folks. Affairs weren't hidden behind velvet curtains. They happened in barns, behind the church, or during long walks through the woods, and everyone noticed. Medieval villages were tight-knit. If you so much as blinked at someone else's spouse, chances are, the baker saw it, the priest heard about it, and by sundown, the whole town was buzzing. Some places had court records full of adultery cases. These weren't always criminal, but they were public and embarrassing. You could be fined, forced to do public penance, or, in some cases, whipped or put in stocks. That's right, you cheat. You stand in the middle of the square while everyone throws cabbage at you. Medieval romance. What about women? Here's the double standard. Men cheated, boys will be boys, women cheated. She's the devil's plaything. Seriously, a woman caught in adultery could face divorce, loss of dowry, exile, or, in harsh places, death. Even suspicion was dangerous. One jealous neighbor could ruin your whole life. Of course, that didn't stop women entirely. Many had secret affairs, carefully arranged during festivals, markets, or while the husband was away. Some even used letters or secret codes to communicate, but they had to be very careful, because getting caught meant losing everything. Love letters, locks of hair, and midnight rendezvous. At the danger, affairs happened, and some were surprisingly sweet. Lovers would exchange notes hidden in prayer books, trade keepsakes, like ribbons, rings, or even pieces of hair. Meet at shrines or forest clearings. Use servants or go-betweens to pass messages. There are surviving letters where lovers called each other my light, my comfort, and my joy in this cruel world. It's honestly kind of adorable, until someone's husband finds the note. Then, not so adorable. Trials, lies, and clever escapes. When someone was accused of adultery, they had a few options. Deny everything. Me, with him. Never. Blame the devil. Yes, seriously, it was a classic excuse. Run away. Not very subtle, but sometimes effective. Some women got creative. There are records of wives hiding lovers in laundry baskets, chicken coops, or even chimneys. One poor guy had to jump out a window into a pile of manure to escape an angry husband. The romance lives on. The church weighs in again. You knew it was coming. The church took adultery very seriously. It was a mortal sin, a crime against marriage, and a great excuse for long, angry sermons. But here's the twist. Church courts were often more forgiving than local ones. They might make you confess, tell you to fast or go on a pilgrimage, or force you to reconcile with your spouse. They didn't always demand punishment, especially if it was a rich person doing the cheating, because medieval justice, not exactly fair. Famous scandal slits end with a few spicy tales. Abelard and Heloise, a teacher and his brilliant student, fell in love, had a child, got caught, and ended up in separate monasteries. Their love letters survived, and they're intense. Marjorie Kemp, a mystic who claimed she once rejected the advances of a would-be seducer, and then ran crying to Jesus. She also wrote one of the first English autobiographies. By the way, Geoffrey Chaucer's characters, in the Canterbury Tales, he filled the pages with cheating millers, horny clerks, and clever wives. It's satire, sure, but rooted in truth. Final thoughts. Adultery in medieval times wasn't just about sneaky kisses and shady meetings. It was a dangerous game, with real risks, and very few happy endings. But people still did it, because love, lust, loneliness, those things don't care about rules, or sermons, or what the neighbors might say. So, if you ever think your love life is complicated, just be glad you don't have to dodge angry husbands, survive manure jumps, or risk cabbage attacks in the town square. Sleep tight, friend. And remember, in history, as in life, people are messy. S3X and sin, how the church tried and failed to control desire *. Alright. Deep breath. We made it. We've wandered through brothels, monasteries, bedrooms, castles, and cabbage-throwing town squares, but now we arrive at the beating heart of medieval morality, the church, and its long, awkward battle with human desire. See, if the Middle Ages had a theme song, it might be, "Don't do that, or you'll go to hell," because for over 1,000 years, the church tried very hard to shape how people loved, touched, and lived, especially when it came to S3X. Did they succeed? Well, not really. But they sure tried. The original rules. Let's start with what the church wanted. According to medieval Christian doctrine, S3X was only okay inside marriage. It had to be for making babies, and it had to be done in the right position with no extra fun stuff and definitely no laughter. Basically, do your duty. Be serious, make a child, then go pray about it. Anything else, like S3X for pleasure, outside marriage, or gasp with the wrong person, was considered sinful. And sin, as we all know, led to punishment, not just in this life, but in the next one. They were watching to enforce all this. The church got involved in pretty much everything. Confession booths became places where people spilled their most private secrets. Priests gave detailed sermons about what married couples could and couldn't do. Church courts ruled on who had sinned and what punishment they deserved. They even published penitential manuals. These were like spiritual rulebooks, and they got weirdly specific. Some examples: S3X on Sundays. Sin, S3X while naked. Sin, S3X during Lent, Advent, or before communion. Sin, sign. Sin, S3X while enjoying it. You guessed it. At one point, they even made a chart ranking sins by severity. Spoiler: oral S3X was near the top, right next to murder. Seriously, the guilt-tripped church used a heavy dose of fear and shame to keep people in line. Paintings in churches showed sinners being dragged to hell by demons. Books described eternal suffering for lustful acts. Even illnesses were blamed on immoral behavior. If something went wrong in your life, a crop failed, a child died, a plague hit, it might be because someone had too much fun under the bed sheets. So you'd better repent, and maybe flagellate yourself a little, just in case. But people still. Where's the thing? People are people. And no matter how many rules were handed down from the pulpit, they didn't always follow them. There's tons of evidence, in poems, letters, court records, and church complaints, that medieval folks were not as holy as they were supposed to be. They had affairs, visited brothels, tried all kinds of positions, laughed, flirted, and fell in love outside marriage. Some confessors even complained that parishioners confessed the same sins week after week, which means they weren't exactly stopping. Let's just say, the struggle between desire and doctrine was very real. A few funny and sad examples. One bishop wrote angrily that peasants were having S3X in barns without shame, like beasts. A noble woman asked her confessor if enjoying S3X with her husband was a sin. He told her only if she smiled afterward. A monk was caught in a tavern with a mistress and claimed the devil made him do it 6 times. And perhaps the most relatable moment, a medieval man confessed that he thought impure thoughts during Mass. The priest told him, "So does everyone." Why the church cared so much? You might be wondering, why all this effort? Well, it wasn't just about controlling bodies. It was about controlling society. If you could regulate who married whom, control when and how people had S3X, decide what counted as a sin, and decide who got punished, then you held a massive amount of power. S3X wasn't just a private act. It was tied to inheritance, legitimacy, property, reputation, gender roles, and the idea of moral order, so the church's obsession with purity wasn't random. It was part of how it kept authority, but the cracks were showing as the centuries went on. Things slowly started to shift. Literature became more open about romance and desire. Women started writing their own stories. Some priests and monks began questioning harsh church teachings, and people, especially commoners, just kept doing what they'd always done. Even some theologians admitted that not everything pleasurable was sinful. They called it conjugal affection, which is medieval for it's okay to enjoy it a little. By the time the Renaissance rolled around, the old rules still existed, but they were a lot harder to enforce. Desire had won. Final thoughts. So what do we take from all this? Medieval life wasn't cold and sexless. It was full of contradictions, quiet rebellions, secret pleasures, public shaming, and private joy. The church tried to build a wall between the holy and the human, but people kept climbing over it, or digging underneath, or just ignoring it completely, because at the end of the day, no matter how many rules were written in stone, love, lust, and longing are part of being human, and you can't really outlaw that.